everybody. In this video we're going to be getting through the first part of the endocrine system, and we're going to start with the nice basic, just what is the endocrine system? So this is one of the 11 organ systems of the body. It works with the nervous system to help control just overall homeostasis. Generally speaking, it is slower than the nervous system is going to be. The effects tend to be more long-lasting than what the nervous system is going to do. It works by releasing hormones instead of neurotransmitters, but it still is just helping to do overall homeostasis is how the endocrine system is going to be working. Endocrinology is the scientific study of the endocrine system. If a person has a problem like diabetes, which we are going to learn later, there's multiple types of diabetes, they will have an endocrinologist, which is the specialist who handles their diabetes. The endocrine glands are the organs of the endocrine system. Usually they're going to end in the word gland, like pituitary gland, thyroid gland, but of course there are exceptions to those rules like ovaries and testes. Those are also going to be endocrine glands. A lot of times endocrine glands will belong in multiple organ systems, like the pancreas is part of the endocrine system, but it's also part of the digestive system. The ovaries and testes that I mentioned a second ago, they're part of the endocrine system. They're also part of the reproductive system. Now, the hormones that get released by the endocrine system, like a lot of chemicals, they can be classified as either autocrines or paracrines. Autocrines are chemicals that are going to act on the same population of cells that release them, while paracrines are going to be released and then affect a different population of cells than the cells that secrete them. So most of our hormones are actually going to be paracrines, and the example that I'm going to give you here. So this sort of vaguely pinkish structure that you see in this picture, I'm going to sort of outline it right here. This is what is known as a pancreatic islet. Used to be called an islet of Langerhans, or Langerhans, but they're now trying to, again, get the names of people out of everything. So pancreatic islet. The cells in there are called alpha cells and beta cells. That's the endocrine structure that's in the pancreas. The cells that are in there that are the bluer cells, those are called beta cells. They release insulin. Insulin, though, doesn't work on beta cells. Instead, the insulin is going to be secreted, eventually get absorbed into the bloodstream, and then go to the liver and go to skeletal muscle and the other cells in the body that have receptors for that insulin, and it's going to act on those cells in the liver. So insulin is a paracrine because it works on other cells elsewhere in the body. Now, this is just sort of an for your information sort of a thing. Most of the diseases of the endocrine system, they happen because you end up with a cell that starts to produce too many copies of itself, and that cell was a hormone producing cell, and so you end up producing too much of that hormone, and so you end up with a little tumor that makes too much of a hormone. What you're seeing here is what is characteristic of a disease called Cushing's disease, and that's characteristic of an adrenal tumor. And it's exactly what I just said. You make a tumor that makes too much of several different hormones, cortisol and aldosterone being the predominant hormones, and you end up with disease symptoms because you're making too much of those hormones. Basic definition for a hormone is it's a chemical released by a gland that is going to exert an effect on other cells someplace else in the body. I know everybody's heard of insulin, or at least everybody should have heard of insulin at this point in your life, but a lot of hormones actually have the name hormone in their name. So you've got growth hormone, corticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicle stimulating hormone. You got a bunch of those little guys running around through there. So hormones are where we're going to be spending most of this chapter. Compare and contrast the nervous system with the endocrine system. So I sort of did this earlier as I was sort of breaking down the endocrine system as a whole, but your nervous system and your endocrine system, they are both going to be concerned with controlling the overall body. The nervous system is going to be doing that through neurotransmitters. You should remember those from last semester. See, I got a new computer and a new monitor. My new monitor is a lot wobblier. I thought it was going to be better, but it's wobblier. So that's neurotransmitters, just in case you don't read my wonderful, beautiful handwriting. The endocrine system, on the other hand, still releasing chemicals, but the name's different. They're called hormones on this side. How those get released is also very different. The neurotransmitters release into a synapse, which, remember, the synapse is just a minute gap between a presynaptic cell and a postsynaptic cell, and it's traveling just seriously, like not even a millimeter, micrometers is how far that's traveling. Hormones, on the other hand, that gets released outside of a cell into the intercellular spaces, into the fluid between cells, which is called extracellular fluid. I'm going to just call that ECF for extracellular fluid. Once it's in the extracellular fluid, it's going to be picked up by the bloodstream. And then once it's in the bloodstream, it goes literally everywhere inside of the body. Now, that does not mean it's going to work everywhere inside of the body, but it is going to get distributed everywhere inside of the body. The other thing that I said earlier is the nervous system tends to be faster, but the response tends to be shorter acting. The endocrine system tends to be slower because, it's going to take time for our chemical to diffuse and then travel everywhere it's supposed to go, but the response tends to be longer lasting. Okay. Next, hormones can be classified as either amino acid based or steroid based. What's the difference between them? This goes back to chemistry, which is, again, one of the reasons why people hate the endocrine system is because, they hated chemistry last semester. Remember that amino acids are the basis for proteins. Amino acids tend to be polar molecules. They tend to like to dissolve in water. That's going to have an impact on how the amino acid based hormones are going to be interacting with cells. So, amino acid based, water soluble. Your steroid based hormones, though, remember, steroids are lipids. Lipids are nonpolar. Nonpolar things do not like to dissolve in water. That means they're going to interact with the cells differently. And so again, amino acids, polar, like water. Steroids, nonpolar, don't like water. Now, the other thing that you have to remember here is the basis for the cell membrane. The cell membrane is predominantly nonpolar with those fatty acid tails that are part of the phospholipid bilayer. Just the heads are polar. Again, this is going to have an impact on what can and cannot get into the cell and then where the receptors are going to be, which is kind of where we're going next. So, in terms of water-soluble versus lipid-soluble hormones, the water-soluble hormones are the ones that are made out of amino acids. The lipid-soluble hormones are the ones that are made out of steroids. Now, here's where things get complicated if you do not remember your chemistry and your cell stuff from last semester. And this is also where things are going to get complicated because I suck at drawing and PowerPoint. You got to remember your basic anatomy of the phospholipid bilayer. And that water can't really pass through that membrane very well. That means things dissolved in that water can't pass through that membrane very well. So water-soluble hormones, they'll be floating around out here and boop, they can't go through this. So instead of being able to pass into the cell and work on receptors inside of the cell, the receptor has to be in the membrane. So the receptor is in the membrane. And then what will happen is the hormone will bind to that receptor, and then that receptor will do something. Sometimes the receptor is a door. The door will open. Things can now pass in and out of the cell. Sometimes that receptor is going to activate a second messenger system. Sometimes that receptor can do a whole slew of different things. But whatever, we bind to the receptor, and as a result of binding to that receptor, something happens inside the cell. Now, over here in the lipid-soluble world, well, since our phospholipid bilayer is a lipid, what that means is we don't need the receptor to be in the membrane because our hormone can just pass directly through that and actually get into the cell. So instead of being in the membrane, the receptor is in the cell. Receptor is in the cell. And so they're acting on different places inside of the cells, or outside of the cells, essentially. So your book has some lovely pictures to try to show you how that works. It gets pretty detailed into some of the effects that the hormones can do. This honestly takes you back to how the nervous system works as well. But here in this case, we've got this hormone that must be one of our amino acid based hormones because it's attaching to a receptor on the outside of the cell, so it's not getting in. And this one happens to be working on what's known as a second messenger system because it's activating a G protein. The G protein is then doing something else and we're making something happen inside of the cell. So we're working through what's known as a second messenger system in this case. And that was because the hormone had to act on a receptor in the membrane. Lipid-soluble hormones, though, they can just go ahead and pass right through, and their receptor is inside here, so we don't really need a second messenger because the hormone can get in there. Why do we need to relay a message? The hormone is the message in that case. Okay. Next, what are the 5 changes listed in the book that a hormonal stimulus can produce? All the things I have highlighted in yellow up there, those are the 5 changes. So they can alter plasma membrane permeability. The way they do that is, again, they can open or close doors. If the door is open, well, now things can pass through that couldn't before. And if the door is closed, now things cannot pass through that could before. Number 2, they can stimulate protein synthesis. So remember protein synthesis, that was transcription and translation from the cell chapter last semester. If we're stimulating that, we are making a protein that we had not been making before. And so that's the cell making an enzyme that it hadn't been making before, or the cell's making a component of milk that it hadn't been making before, but the cell's making something, essentially. Number 3, activate or deactivate enzyme systems. That can go along with that second messenger system earlier, but it means the cells are doing things or they stop doing things. And hormones can do either or. Number 4, induce secretory activity. So remember, secretion is the release of chemical products. So hormones can make cells release other things. Again, milk is a really good thing to think of there. You've got hormones that can make, usually women, secrete milk so that they can feed babies. And last, number 5, stimulate mitosis. Growth hormone is a great example for that one. When you release growth hormone, you stimulate the epiphyseal plate in your bones. Throwback to AMP1. And that helps your bones get bigger. That same growth hormone also helps your muscles to get bigger so that they grow as your bones grow. And so you've got hormones that can do all sorts of different things inside the body. How is it that a hormone can affect one population of cells and have no impact on another? So one of the things that I tried to stress earlier was hormones are traveling literally everywhere in the body because they're moving around in the bloodstream. So let's go back to that growth hormone that I mentioned just a second ago. Your growth hormone is being secreted by the pituitary gland. It's going to the bones, to the muscles, to the liver, and it's going to the brain, but it doesn't stimulate the brain. So how does it know that it's supposed to make your bones grow, but not make your brain grow? Well, that's because of the action of receptors. If a cell has a receptor for that hormone, that means that cell can respond to that hormone. If it does not have a receptor, that cell basically ignores that hormone and it can't do anything to it. So the brain has no receptors for growth hormone and it can't do anything when growth hormone bumps into it. But your bones and your muscles and your liver, they do have receptors to growth hormone. And so it's all about receptors. If the receptors are there, we can do something. If the receptors are not there or the receptors are broken, we can't do anything. And that's a very important thing. So we're again going to talk about diabetes in a lot of detail later. There's 2 main types of diabetes mellitus. One of them is a person does not make insulin. The other is their receptors become unresponsive. And so there's really 2 different diseases based on what ends up being broken inside of the cell. So don't think this is just a hormone problem. Sometimes it's a receptor problem. Next, just some definitions. You're never just releasing one hormone. You're always releasing a bunch of hormones. And those hormones can and will interact with each other. So there's different types of interactions that can occur. Permissiveness means that one hormone gives permission to another hormone to do its job. And a great example of that would be the hormones that you release at puberty. When you release either your testosterone or your estrogen and your progesterone, you can release those all day, every day, but if you don't have thyroid hormone, they cannot really do their job. So they need thyroid hormone's permission to actually work to trigger the onset of puberty. So that's a permissive relationship between the sex hormones and thyroid hormone. Synergism is when multiple hormones all do the same thing. So you have a hormone called glucagon. It increases your blood sugar level. You have a hormone called cortisol. It increases your blood sugar level. You have a hormone called epinephrine. It increases your blood sugar level. Growth hormone increases your blood sugar level. So you have a bunch of different hormones that can all increase your blood sugar level. And if you release them all at once, your blood sugar is going to skyrocket. That's synergism. That is when all of them do the same thing. And then last, we have antagonism. It's the opposite of synergism. It's when two hormones have opposite effects. And we actually talked about one example of this last semester when we talked about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone in the bone chapter. So calcitonin helped to make your bones stronger. It did that by lowering your blood calcium levels. Parathyroid hormone raised your blood calcium levels. So those two hormones do opposite things to your blood calcium levels. They are antagonistic to each other. Next up, I gave you this picture to go ahead and label. This gives you your major endocrine glands. The most confusing part for most students is the small little things that are happening up here in the brain. Pineal gland is the one towards the posterior section. It's sort of nestled in between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. Pineal gland is going to secrete melatonin to help regulate your circadian rhythms. The hypothalamus, very important part of the brain. It does secrete a couple of hormones, and it sends them down to the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus regulates what the pituitary gland does. Pituitary gland is the gland that's set in that sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, if you remember that from last semester. So the hypothalamus is just superior to the pituitary gland. Next, the butterfly-shaped gland right here, that whole thing, that's the thyroid gland. This picture never really does this justice, but on the back of the thyroid gland, there's different numbers in different people, but this picture is showing 4 parathyroid glands. Thymus gland. By the time a person is the age of this person, the thymus gland is not this big. It gets smaller as you get older, but it is just superior to the heart. Each kidney has an adrenal gland sitting just superior to it. Pancreas is just inferior to the stomach. And then ovaries for females, cis females, and then testes for cis males. So that's what you've got going on for those. Pardon me. Take some time to sit there and practice labeling those things. Hopefully that helps you. This picture, my notes say, is on page 602 in your book, and that's where I'm going to go ahead and stop this particular video.